Julian Mercer had spent 20 years learning the language of quiet things. He knew what a root ball felt like when a young cedar was ready to be moved, knew how long loam should rest after rain before it could be turned without bruising, knew that most living things did not die dramatically, but by degrees, by inches, by the almost invisible surrender of color. In spring, he could walk the rows of his nursery before sunrise with a mug of black coffee warming his hand and tell, at a glance, which hydrangeas had taken the cold too hard and which boxwoods would push through, stubborn and green, as if winter had only sharpened their resolve. He had built a life around growth that asked for patience. He trusted seasons more than speeches. It was, perhaps, why he had not noticed at first that his marriage was not breaking. It was simply losing chlorophyll. Their house sat in an old neighborhood just outside the city, where front porches still held rocking chairs and mature oaks cast generous shade over cracked sidewalks. The place had not been glamorous when they bought it, but Julian had seen its bones the way he saw a neglected yard, not for what it was, but for what careful hands could coax from it. He had redrawn the back garden himself, terracing the slope into 3 soft levels edged with stone, planting Japanese maples where the light shifted gold in late afternoon, and training climbing roses along a cedar trellis he built over 2 weekends while Serena answered emails inside and occasionally came to the screen door to say it looked beautiful. Back then, she had meant it. Back then, she had still stepped outside barefoot to stand beside him in the dusk and asked the names of things she would never remember, touching petals as if gentleness came naturally to her. They had raised 2 children in that house, and then, as happens in so many decent tragedies, the children became their own weather systems and moved on. Owen was at college in Michigan studying environmental policy, full of sharp opinions and an earnestness Julian secretly admired. Lily was farther east, at a university in Vermont, where she changed her major twice and sent voice notes instead of calling because, as she once explained, she liked to think while walking. Julian kept every voice note. Serena, meanwhile, said the silence of an empty house gave her room to expand. For a while, he thought that sounded healthy. It was only later he understood that some people confuse expansion with escape. Serena had always been bright in a way that drew rooms toward her. Even at 50, she could enter a crowded fundraiser and somehow alter the shape of the air, making people straighten without knowing why. She was a marketing director for a mid-sized public relations firm that had begun pivoting aggressively into political consulting. And lately she had attached herself to a local election project with the zeal of someone who had mistaken proximity for destiny. The candidate was forgettable enough, a county commissioner with practiced smiles and carefully rolled sleeves. But the campaign world surrounding him glittered in Serena's imagination with a light far stronger than truth. She spoke now in brisk, energized fragments over dinner, polling, messaging, donor dinners, field strategy, media buys, as if the mere use of those words elevated her from suburban routine into a corridor of power. Julian listened, nodded, and asked questions when she paused for breath. He always had. There had been years when her ambitions outpaced her footing, and Julian had steadied the ladder without complaint. When she wanted to leave a stable corporate job to join a smaller firm with better upside, he refinanced equipment at the nursery to free up cash during the transition. When she wanted to host networking dinners at their home, he pruned the garden until it looked like the yard of people more important than they were. When she wanted to pursue an executive certificate that required weekends away and money they had not planned to spend, he took extra design contracts landscaping boutique hotels and municipal courtyards. He did these things not because he was weak, as some men would have feared, but because devotion had always come naturally to him in the form of labor. He watered what he loved. Yet in the last year something in Serena had begun to harden and to shine. It showed first in details so small they felt unworthy of suspicion. A perfume that was not hers, sharper and more expensive than the one she'd worn for years, with a clean metallic finish that lingered in hallways after she passed. Dresses she claimed were for professional optics, cut a little sleeker, hemmed a little higher, chosen in colors that did not ask to be noticed so much as assumed they would be. New heels that clicked across hardwood with the confidence of a verdict. There was also the matter of timing. Serena had once moved through evenings with a tired familiarity, dropping her bag by the entry table, rubbing her neck, asking what Julian wanted to do for dinner in the softened voice of a woman stepping back into private life. Now she came home lit from within by outside electricity, as if the real day began only after she left the house. Her phone remained in her hand, even at the table. She laughed at messages she did not share. She grew oddly attentive to the mirror in the foyer, checking lipstick before stepping out to events that seemed less about work than theater. More than once, Julian stood at the kitchen sink rinsing arugula from the garden while she rushed past him in a fitted coat and said, "Don't wait up. These campaign dinners always run long." And he would hear in her voice not apology, not fatigue, but anticipation. The name Victor began appearing in their life the way invasive ivy first appears at a fence line. Too ordinary at first to alarm anyone, then suddenly everywhere. Victor Hale, campaign director, strategic mind, charismatic operator. Serena said his name with a casual admiration she probably believed was well concealed. Victor thinks we should reposition the messaging. Victor says suburban women are the deciding margin. Victor loved the donor deck I built. Victor wants me at the policy luncheon. Victor says if this goes well there could be bigger races next year. At first Julian built a polite silhouette of the man from fragments. Expensive suits, precise teeth, the kind of confidence that did not grow from conviction but from constant rehearsal. He pictured someone who knew how to shake hands while looking over shoulders for someone more useful. He had met men like that at city planning functions and conservation fundraisers. Men who mistook velocity for substance, who treated every conversation as either a ladder or furniture. Serena had started orbiting that kind of gravity. It changed her. Or perhaps it merely revealed which parts of her had long been dormant. On Thursday nights, she began attending post-event drinks with the campaign staff, though she rarely drank much before. On Saturdays, she said, she needed visibility, which meant brunches, local panels, neighborhood mixers, ribbon cuttings, all those civic rituals where ambition wears a smile and calls itself service. Julian noticed that she no longer asked him to come. Once, years ago, she would have insisted. He had been the quiet husband with broad shoulders and unexpectedly thoughtful observations, the one who made people feel less crowded when they spoke to him. But now, whenever he offered, she would say something airy and efficient like, "Honestly, it's all just consultant chatter, you'd be bored to death," or, "It's better if I move through those spaces freely." Freely. The words settled in him like a small stone. He did not object. Julian was not a man who believed love could be improved by force. He had spent a career shaping landscapes that taught him every living structure needed room. Still, even a tree given too much space can split under its own reach. In the nursery, the employees had begun noticing he was there later. He stayed after closing under the excuse of inventory, walking the gravel paths between the potted magnolias and serviceberries, while irrigation lines hissed softly in the dark. His hands knew work better than worry, so he repotted seedlings that did not need repotting and revised planting sketches that had already been approved. At home, the bed had become a wide and oddly formal piece of furniture. Serena slid beneath the sheets with the glow of her phone, lighting her face blue-white in the dark. Sometimes she smiled at something on the screen and turned away, saying she was answering a volunteer coordinator or fixing a press draft. Julian lay beside her listening to the tiny weather of distance, the tap of her nails, the faint rush of traffic outside, the old radiator settling in the wall. There are marriages that explode under the pressure of betrayal, and there are marriages that begin to evaporate years before any proof arrives, leaving behind only the mineral outline of what used to be tenderness. Julian, though he did not yet know the word betrayal belonged to him, had begun living inside that outline. There were moments that might have warned a less trusting man sooner. One Sunday morning Serena came down wearing running clothes Julian had never seen before, sleek black and gold, her ponytail tied with unnatural care. She said Victor had convinced the senior campaign team to do a visibility jog through a park before a charity breakfast, a phrase so absurd Julian nearly smiled. Instead, he looked at her, the expensive leggings, the fresh perfume, the phone already in her palm, and asked if she wanted coffee first. "No time," she said, kissing the air near his cheek instead of his skin. "This world moves fast, Jules." He stood in the doorway after she left, coffee cooling in his hand, and watched her taillights dissolve at the end of the street. "This world moves fast." It was not merely a statement. It was an accusation against everything he was. Julian moved at the speed of root systems, weather, and stone settling. He moved at the speed of commitment. Perhaps that was why Serena had begun to look at him the way city developers looked at mature trees standing in the path of new construction. Not with hatred, exactly, but with impatience disguised as practicality. He tried, in the old, decent ways, to bridge what he could feel widening. He booked dinner at a quiet place she used to love, one with linen napkins and amber lighting and waiters who knew enough not to interrupt. Serena spent most of the meal talking about an upcoming donor retreat at a historic inn and barely touched the sea base. He suggested maybe they take a weekend in the mountains after the election cycle. She smiled at him with a softness so practiced it hurt more than indifference. "Let's get through this season first," she said, as though their life together were a waiting room for her real one. He bought her white peonies from a grower 2 counties over, because she once said no flower looked more elegant. She thanked him absently and left them in the paper wrap until the outer petals browned. He offered to redo the front walkway in bluestone because she'd mentioned the house needed to feel more polished if campaign people came by. She replied that most meetings were elsewhere now, that nobody in politics really gathered in private homes unless there was serious money involved. Julian looked at the house he had built with his hands, at the garden maturing exactly as planned, at the woman standing in its center already speaking of it as though it belonged to an older, lesser version of herself. The children sensed something too, even from far away. Lily asked during one of her voice notes whether Mom was doing okay, because her texts had become all exclamation points and selfies at events. Owen, in his blunter way, said during a Sunday call, "Dad, I don't want to overstep, but Mom sounds like she joined a cult for people who wear blazers." Julian laughed because that was what fathers do when they are trying not to make their children carry adult shadows. "She's busy," he said. "Election season." Owen made a doubtful sound, but let it go. Julian protected Serena then, even as she drifted from him. That may have been the last pure kindness he gave her. One evening in early October, the first true cold front slipping through the city, Serena returned from a fundraiser wrapped in a cream coat he had never seen before. Her cheeks held the faint flush of outdoor air and social adrenaline. There was a smear of gold highlighter on one collarbone, a detail so glamorous and so unlike the woman who used to fall asleep reading grocery lists that Julian almost did not recognize her. She set her bag down and walked into the kitchen where he was trimming stems from a bucket of late dahlias. "You should have seen it tonight," she said, not really to him but to the room. The energy, the donors, the local press. It felt like standing near the engine of something bigger. Julian placed the shears on the counter. "Bigger than what?" She laughed lightly, taking a sparkling water from the refrigerator. "Oh, come on. Bigger than this." She didn't mean the kitchen. She meant the house, the nursery, the old rhythms, the years that had held her without applause. For a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, a wind moved through the maple by the fence, and brittle leaves scraped softly across the deck, like paper being shuffled in another room. Julian looked down at the dahlias in his hand, deep burgundy, almost black at the center, their petals immaculate and doomed. "Everything big still dies back in winter," he said, not as a warning, not yet, only as truth. Serena took a sip and smiled with the indulgence people reserve for provincial wisdom. "That's why some of us don't plan to stay planted," she said. And there it was, though not yet in a form that could be. Named in court or confession. Not the affair, not the lie, but the first clean sound of a root being severed underground, far from where anyone could see it, deep enough that for a while the tree still looked alive. By the middle of October, the house no longer sounded like a marriage. It sounded like logistics. Doors opening and closing. Cabinet hinges. Serena's heels crossing the hardwood in quick, purposeful strokes. The low murmur of her voice behind half-closed doors. Julian had once believed that love could survive almost anything except contempt, and what unsettled him now was not that Serena seemed angry, nor even distant, but that she behaved as though his presence had become administratively inconvenient. He was a calendar item she kept rescheduling in her head, a dependable structure she had already stopped seeing, and yet he still moved carefully around the life they had built, as if tenderness might return if he did not startle it. In the nursery, autumn had entered its final clear note before decline. Maples were turning in bands of ember and brass. Ornamental grasses leaned silver under the morning frost. Customers came looking for late-season shrubs and asking whether it was too late to plant before the ground hardened, and Julian answered them in the steady, measured voice people trusted, though inwardly he had begun to understand how much damage can happen while the surface remains calm. Every day, in the rows between pines and hydrangeas and dormant perennials tagged for spring, he found himself thinking not of Serena directly, but of the difference between neglect and design. A branch broken by wind was one kind of ruin. A branch cut cleanly for shaping was another. The first was accident. The second had intention behind it. He had started to suspect intention in the way Serena now arranged her life. It was not one moment, but an accumulation. The screen angled away when she texted, the laughter that bloomed at odd hours and died the instant he entered the room, the precision with which she explained where she would be before he asked, as though rehearsing an alibi for a crime not yet discovered. She had become newly generous in strange, tactical ways. She thanked him too brightly for ordinary things. She brought home pastries from a cafe near campaign headquarters, pastries she never remembered he disliked, and set them on the counter with a chirping sweetness that sounded more like appeasement than affection. One night she suggested they open a bottle of wine, just because, then spent half the evening refreshing email. Another evening, she came home carrying a scarf in a shade of muted green she said made her think of him. Julian took it in his hands and felt, with almost physical certainty, that it had not been chosen from love, but from guilt. It still smelled faintly of department store perfume and new paper tissue. He thanked her anyway. Good men are often most vulnerable when they remain committed to civility long after civility has ceased to be mutual. The moment itself arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening, which Julian would later think was the cruelest part. Betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. It enters dressed as interruption. Serena was upstairs in the bedroom, getting ready for another campaign dinner, while Julian stood in the mudroom unlacing his boots after closing the nursery early to beat a line of rain moving in from the west. He could hear drawers opening overhead, hangers sliding, the familiar domestic score of shared life. Then Serena's phone, which she had left charging on the kitchen island, lit up and began to buzz in short, urgent pulses against the quartz countertop. Julian did not reach for it immediately. He only glanced, the way anyone glances when a sound enters a room unexpectedly. What he saw first was not the message itself, but the name. Victor. There was no last name attached. Just Victor, as intimate as breath. The screen brightened again before dimming, and with that involuntary, treacherous luck that changes lives, the preview remained visible long enough for his eyes to catch the line beneath it. Miss you already. One more month, and then it's our turn. Julian stood very still. Rain tapped once against the back window, and then again, as if testing the glass. The refrigerator motor hummed. Upstairs, Serena was moving from closet to mirror in the careless safety of a person who believes her secrets are protected by habit. Julian did not touch the phone. He did not need to. The message was small, almost laughably small, and yet it split the room open. For a few seconds he felt nothing at all, which frightened him more than pain would have. Then sensation returned in layers. The heaviness in his chest, the faint tingling in his fingers, the peculiar clarity with which he noticed everything around him. The bowl of pears on the counter, one gone soft at the stem, the tiny chip in the glaze of Serena's favorite mug, the muddy arc his boot had left on the tile. The mind, when injured deeply enough, becomes cruelly attentive. He heard Serena descending the stairs and stepped away from the island just as she swept into the kitchen, fastening an earring. "Did my phone go off?" she asked. Julian wiped his hands on a dish towel, though they were clean. "Twice," he said. "You left it down here." She crossed to the counter too quickly, picked it up, and looked at the screen with the sort of composed blankness that is more revealing than alarm. "Campaign nonsense," she said. "Everyone thinks everything is urgent." Then she smiled, a bright efficient thing with no warmth in it. "I'll be late. Don't wait up." Julian nodded. He could have said Victor's name then. He could have asked who missed her already, whose turn was coming, what exactly needed to end in a month. But he felt, with a steadiness that seemed to arrive from somewhere colder and older than emotion, that asking too early would only drive the truth back underground. He had spent his adult life learning how living systems reveal themselves. If you pull at a stem to make it grow faster, you tear it. If you need to know where rot begins, you do not strike the trunk. You follow the discoloration inward. Drive safe, he said. Serena leaned forward and kissed the air near his face again. The move was so practiced, so devoid of contact, that it seemed less like affection than muscle memory performed for appearances. Then she was gone, taking with her the expensive scent that no longer belonged in his home. Julian remained in the kitchen until the rain came harder. He turned off the overhead light and stood in the dimness, watching drops stream down the dark window over the sink. Somewhere in the yard, a branch shifted and tapped the fence. He thought, absurdly, of all the years he had spent making Serena's life smoother without ever calling it sacrifice. The second car when her commute increased. The temporary line of credit that covered a bad quarter at her firm. The weekends lost to donor dinners, networking brunches, campaign launch parties where he had parked cars, plated hors d'oeuvres, cleaned wine glasses, and let people talk over him because he knew how much it mattered to her to be seen as rising. He had never demanded credit for this. Love, to him, had not been a transaction. But now he began to understand how often she had mistaken his silence for lack of consequence. 3 nights later, he heard Victor's voice. Not clearly at first, only as a deep masculine cadence leaking through the narrow opening of the study door, while Serena believed he was outside covering frost-sensitive saplings. Julian had come in through the side entrance for a forgotten invoice folder and stopped when he heard her laugh, a low, softened laugh he had not heard directed at him in years. He stood motionless in the hallway while her words drifted out in fragments. No, he doesn't suspect anything. Then quieter. Then another laugh. Then, with a fondness so intimate it turned the air metallic in his mouth. You are impossible. My mayor. A pause followed, and Serena's tone dropped further, becoming playful in a way that did not belong to marriage. No, you're mayor. I told you, don't say that unless it's just us. Fine. Then you're my mayor. Julian's hand tightened around the folder until the cardboard edge bit into his palm. The title itself was ridiculous, vain, adolescent in its fantasy of power, and somehow that made it worse. Betrayal, he realized then, was not always grand or cinematic. Sometimes it was embarrassingly ordinary. A middle-aged woman in her own home lowering her voice for a man who sold ambition like perfume. He waited until he heard the call end before stepping loudly enough in the mudroom to announce his return. When Serena emerged from the study, she looked almost flushed, though whether from wine, excitement, or vanity Julian no longer cared to guess. Oh, she said too quickly. You're back. Forgot a folder, he replied. You sounded busy. Serena tucked a strand of hair behind one ear. Victor needed final revisions on donor messaging. The lie was smooth. That, more than anything, offended him. Not that she lied, but that she assumed he was the kind of man to whom a smooth lie would be sufficient. The next week, she presented the Amazon trip. It happened. On a Sunday afternoon under a sky the color of unpolished pewter. Julian had spent the morning winterizing the irrigation system and came inside with damp cuffs and cold hands to find Serena at the dining table with her laptop open, smiling in a way that instantly made him wary. On the polished wood beside her sat a navy presentation folder and a small wrapped box. I have something for you, she said. The sentence landed strangely. Serena had not brought him a surprise gift in years. Julian set down his gloves and took the seat opposite her. What kind of trouble is this? He asked mildly. She laughed with what would have seemed, to anyone else, like affection. The good kind. Open it. Inside the box was a compact, elegant pair of travel binoculars. In the folder were printed itineraries, accommodation details, and a brochure thick with photographs of impossible green. A 1-month stay near a protected Amazonian ecological reserve in Brazil, structured around guided forest walks, bird-watching excursions, river observations, and conservation programming for visiting enthusiasts. There were images of canopy towers disappearing into morning mist, scarlet macaws burning like embers against the trees, water broad as polished stone under clouded sunsets. It was, objectively, the sort of trip Julian might once have considered a dream. Serena leaned forward, studying his face too carefully. You've always wanted to see something untouched, she said. Somewhere truly wild. And with the campaign entering the final push, I'm going to be out of state for almost a month anyway helping on a coordinated strategy rollout. I thought, maybe instead of you being here alone, you could finally take a real adventure. Her voice was sweet, strategic, perfect. The timing clicked into place with such sinister neatness that Julian almost admired it. She was not merely leaving. She was removing him, not with an argument or an ultimatum, but with a gift designed to flatter him into absence. He looked down at the itinerary again. Departure in 10 days. Return 4 weeks later. Enough time for a campaign retreat. Enough time for a private world. Enough time, perhaps, for Serena to step fully into whatever fantasy she and Victor had been feeding each other under the noble umbrella of public service. That's generous, Julian said. He made sure the pause before the words sounded like surprise rather than calculation. Serena reached across the table and touched the back of his hand. Her skin felt cool. You deserve it, Jules. Honestly, you do. You've worked nonstop for years. And this way I won't feel guilty being buried in campaign work. We can both do something important for a month. Important. The language of shared purpose over the machinery of deceit. Julian lifted one of the brochures and studied a photograph of dense rainforest reflected in black water. A month is a long time, he said. Serena's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Too long. No, Julian answered, looking up with a small smile he knew would reassure her. Just longer than I expected. But maybe that's the point. Relief passed through her so quickly she likely thought he did not see it. Exactly. You need to be away long enough to actually unwind. Away long enough. There it was again, intention wearing kindness like a tailored coat. Julian closed the folder. Then I should go. Serena's smile broadened, and for the first time in months she embraced him with what looked, from any doorway, like genuine warmth. He stood still while her arms circled him and understood with perfect, icy clarity that this was not reconciliation. It was clearance. That evening she cooked, another unnatural gesture. Pasta with lemon and herbs. The kind of meal she had not voluntarily made since the children were in high school. She opened wine, asked about the nursery's winter ordering schedule, laughed at a story he told from memory because he needed her to believe he was still moving inside the old script. The whole dinner felt staged on a set built to imitate marriage. Julian played his part so well that even he was surprised by the ease of it. He asked whether her out-of-state campaign work would be exhausting. Serena sighed theatrically and said, exhausting, yes. But in a good way. This could be career-defining. Victor, though unmentioned, seemed present at the table like a third candle. Later, when she went upstairs, Julian remained in the kitchen alone, his hand resting on the brochure. The Amazon photographs no longer looked inviting. They looked like camouflage. He thought of how often deception borrows the appearance of generosity, because people lower their guard in the presence of a gift. In the nursery, invasive species were sometimes sold under harmless names, ornamental at first glance, pretty enough to be welcomed into gardens before they strangled everything around them. Serena's trip was beautiful in exactly that way. Over the next several days, he let her see him becoming excited. He asked practical questions about luggage, vaccinations, riverboats. He ordered field shirts and light gear he had no intention of using. He spent an evening reading aloud from the reserve's website, while Serena sat with one leg folded under her on the sofa, texting with her face illuminated in soft domestic lamplight, nodding absently at intervals that made it plain she was hearing only enough to sustain the illusion. Once, he caught the corner of a smile on her mouth while she read a message and knew it was not for him. The realization no longer pierced. It settled. Pain was changing its chemistry. On Wednesday, as if to confirm what instinct had already concluded, Serena left her laptop open on the breakfast bar while taking a call in the laundry room. Julian was not a man who rummaged. He had never searched her things, never tracked accounts, never believed love improved under surveillance. But trust, once dishonored, is not noble if it remains blind. It is simply neglect by another name. He crossed to the laptop and glanced at the open inbox. There, between campaign calendars and donor briefings, sat a chain of messages with Victor marked by a subject line so bland it was almost laughable. Revised talking points. One email contained only a hotel booking confirmation for 2 adjoining reservation numbers at a boutique in another state, the sort of place campaigns used for strategy retreats. Another included a forwarded itinerary for a private tasting dinner and a note from Victor that read, Can't wait to have you to myself after the donor crowd clears. Serena's reply, visible in preview beneath it, was even shorter. Then make sure my husband is happily in the jungle by then. Julian closed the laptop carefully. The room did not spin. He did not shake. Instead, he experienced a stillness so complete it felt like weather after a storm has sucked all noise from the fields. Some people think rage arrives hot. They are wrong. The most dangerous kind arrives cold enough to preserve detail. Serena re-entered carrying a basket of folded towels and found him rinsing a coffee cup. Was that Owen? He asked. She blinked once, recalibrating. No. Campaign. Call. Busy season, he said. Tell me about it. She laughed. He smiled. The performance continued. That night, Julian sat alone in the backyard long after Serena went to bed. The garden had entered that melancholy interval between splendor and sleep, when the last leaves cling not from strength, but from habit. The stone paths held a trace of moonlight. Wind lifted through the bare upper branches and moved on. He thought of the Amazon, of how she had imagined him thousands of miles away beneath some foreign canopy, while she rewrote their life with another man under the banner of civic ambition. He thought of Victor, polished and predatory, baiting Serena with titles and proximity to influence, because people like him understood the weakness in people like her. Not lust alone, but vanity, the craving to feel chosen by power. Julian sat with these thoughts until they ceased to feel like thoughts and became structure. By the time he rose and went inside, he was no longer drifting through injury. He was building a plan. He would not confront. He would not plead. He would not shatter the house with scenes Serena could later rearrange into stories about neglect, stagnation, emotional distance, or any of the polished little lies unfaithful people use when they need to feel like protagonists instead of cowards. He would know everything first. He would let the truth harden into evidence. He would make certain that when the season turned, it turned completely. In bed, Serena slept on her side facing away from him, one hand curled near her pillow, breathing with the ease of a woman who believed she had managed every variable. Julian lay awake in the dark and looked at the faint outline of the ceiling. Somewhere downstairs, the refrigerator clicked on. A car passed outside. He folded his hands over his chest and let the silence settle into him like frost into ground. There are moments when a life divides so cleanly that no witness sees the cut. Nothing outward changes. The house remains standing. The wife sleeps. The husband says good morning at breakfast. Yet beneath the surface, roots are being severed one by one with calm and exacting hands. When Serena finally left for her month of campaign work, she would believe she had arranged the board in her favor. What she did not understand was that Julian had stopped playing defense the moment she tried to gift him his own disappearance. Serena left on a gray morning that seemed undecided about whether to rain or hold its breath. She moved through the house with a purposeful lightness, suitcase wheels whispering across the hardwood, her phone tucked between shoulder and ear as she confirmed last-minute details in a tone that blended authority with a kind of bright anticipation she no longer bothered to hide. Julian stood by the front door, one hand resting on the brass handle, watching her as one might watch a storm pass across a distant field, aware of its power, but no longer inclined to chase it. Don't forget your passport, she said, pausing just long enough to glance at him. And your yellow fever vaccination card. They can be strict about that. Julian nodded, lifting his small travel bag as if he were truly preparing to leave that afternoon. I've got it all, he replied. Serena smiled, satisfied. Good. This is going to be good for you, Jules. Really. A reset. A reset. The word echoed faintly as she stepped out into the cold air, her coat catching the wind for a moment before settling around her like a flag claiming new territory. Julian watched her car pull away, the taillights shrinking at the end of the street until they disappeared entirely. Only then did he close the door. The house fell into a silence that was no longer hollow, but deliberate. He set his travel bag down on the entry bench and stood there for a long moment, listening to the stillness. It felt different now, not abandoned, not empty, but waiting. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee, and opened his laptop. The Amazon itinerary still sat in his inbox, pristine and untouched. With a few quiet clicks, he canceled the entire trip. The confirmation email arrived seconds later. Refund processed. Reservation voided. It was almost anticlimactic, the way a single action could erase a narrative Serena had carefully constructed. Julian stared at the screen for a moment longer, then closed the laptop. The jungle would not be his destination. Not this time. By noon, he had made the call. The private investigator's office was located downtown, above a law firm that specialized in corporate disputes. The receptionist's voice was efficient, neutral. Within the hour, Julian found himself seated across from a man named Harris, whose demeanor suggested a lifetime spent observing other people's mistakes without judgment or surprise. "I need documentation," Julian said, his voice steady. "Clear, verifiable. Dates, locations, photographs. Nothing illegal. Nothing that can be contested." Harris nodded, as if he had heard the same request 100 times before. "You're not looking for drama," he said. "You're looking for certainty." Julian considered the phrasing. "I'm looking for the truth to be undeniable." Harris leaned back slightly, studying him. "That usually means you already know the truth." "Knowing and proving are not the same thing," Julian replied. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness. Just a calm that made the air between them feel heavier. Harris gave a small, almost respectful nod. "We can start immediately." The arrangement was simple. Serena's travel details were easy enough to obtain. Campaign schedules, hotel bookings, public appearances. What mattered was everything that happened in the spaces between those official events. Harris would follow, document, and report. Julian left the office with a folder of paperwork and a quiet understanding that something irreversible had begun. The first report came 2 days later. Julian was in the nursery, kneeling beside a row of dormant shrubs, when his phone vibrated in his pocket. He wiped his hands on his jeans before opening the message. A single image loaded slowly on the screen. Serena, standing outside a boutique hotel in another state. Her coat open, her expression relaxed in a way Julian had not seen in months. Beside her stood Victor. He was exactly as Julian had imagined. Tailored, composed, the kind of man who wore confidence like a second skin. They were not touching in the photograph, not explicitly. But the space between them was too small, the angle of their bodies too familiar. Julian looked at the image for a long moment, then locked his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He did not react outwardly. He finished checking the shrubs, adjusted the irrigation schedule, and spoke with a customer about soil pH as if nothing had shifted. But something had. The abstraction of suspicion had condensed into form. Over the next week, more evidence arrived. Each message from Harris was concise, clinical. Time-stamped photographs. Brief notes. No commentary. No speculation. Just facts. Serena and Victor entering the same hotel late at night. Serena leaving the campaign office early, meeting Victor at a restaurant that did not appear on any official itinerary. Serena laughing across a table, her posture leaning forward in a way that suggested intimacy rather than strategy. Julian reviewed each piece of evidence with the same measured attention he gave to his work. He did not linger longer than necessary. He did not zoom in. He did not search for emotional meaning beyond what was already evident. The facts were sufficient. And yet, there were moments when the images cut through his composure with a precision that surprised him. One evening, after closing the nursery, he sat alone in his truck and opened a video file Harris had sent. It was short, taken from a distance. Serena and Victor exiting a private entrance of the hotel, their conversation inaudible, but their body language unmistakable. Victor placed a hand lightly at the small of her back as they walked. Serena did not pull away. She leaned into the gesture as if it belonged there. Julian watched the clip once. Then he turned off the screen and sat in the dark cab of the truck, the faint smell of soil and pine clinging to his clothes. For a brief moment, something sharp moved through him. Not rage, not even grief, but a kind of hollow recognition. The woman in the video was not the woman who had once stood barefoot in their garden asking the names of flowers. Or perhaps she had always been both, and he had chosen to see only one version. He rested his hands on the steering wheel and let the feeling pass. Pain, he realized, had a rhythm. If you did not chase it, it moved through you and left something clearer behind. By the second week, the evidence was no longer ambiguous. Harris's reports documented overnight stays, private dinners, extended periods where Serena's official schedule did not align with her actual movements. There were photographs of them seated close together in dimly lit spaces, their expressions unguarded, their proximity unmistakable. Still nothing explicit, nothing that crossed into indecency. But enough. More than enough. Julian printed each report and placed it in a folder on his desk at home. He organized them chronologically, labeling each section with dates and locations. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic. There was a strange comfort in the order of it, in the way facts could be arranged into a narrative that required no interpretation. This was not a story he was telling himself. It was a record. At night, the house remained quiet. Julian moved through it with a new awareness, as if seeing it from a distance. Serena's absence no longer felt like a temporary gap. It felt like a completed exit. He slept better than he expected. Not deeply, but without the restless turning that had marked the weeks before. Clarity, even painful clarity, was easier to inhabit than uncertainty. One evening, as he sat at the dining table reviewing the latest report, his gaze drifted to the far end where Serena's chair remained pushed in neatly. He tried, for a moment, to recall the last time they had shared a meal without distraction, without the invisible presence of something else between them. The memory did not come. Instead, he found himself thinking about the concept of ownership, not of things, but of truth. Serena had assumed she controlled the narrative of their marriage, that she could step outside it without consequence as long as she managed appearances. Victor had assumed he could insert himself into that narrative without resistance, that Julian would remain a passive figure in the background. Both of them had underestimated the one quality Julian had cultivated his entire life: patience. Patience was not an action. It was preparation. The final piece arrived on a cold Thursday morning. Harris's message was slightly longer this time. Confirmed extended stay. Shared suite. Full documentation attached. Julian opened the file. The images were clear, undeniable. Serena and Victor entering a hotel room together, their movements unguarded in the assumption of privacy. Julian did not need to see more. He closed the file after a few seconds and set the phone down on the table. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He sat there for a long time, not moving, not thinking in any conventional sense. The evidence had reached its conclusion. There was nothing left to discover. Only decisions remained. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden. The maples were nearly bare now, their branches etched against the pale sky. The last leaves clung stubbornly, trembling in the wind. Soon, they would fall. Not dramatically, not all at once, just one by one, until the tree stood exposed and honest in its structure. Julian exhaled slowly. "It's enough," he said aloud, though no one was there to hear it. And in that moment, something within him settled completely. Not broken, not hardened, simply resolved. The hunt was over. What remained was the harvest. Julian began the dismantling on a Monday before sunrise, when the world was still soft with frost and no one expected decisions to be made. He woke without an alarm, the way he always had on days that mattered, and lay for a moment in the quiet bed, listening to the faint hum of the house. There was no hesitation in him anymore. The weeks of observation, the careful accumulation of evidence, had burned away whatever uncertainty once lived beneath his patience. What remained was not anger. It was clarity sharpened into action. He dressed in the dark, moved through the hallway without turning on lights, and stepped outside into the cold air. The garden held a thin veil of white across its surfaces, each leaf edged in frost like a memory preserved too long. Julian stood there briefly, taking in the shape of everything he had built: the terraced stone, the dormant beds, the skeletal branches waiting for spring, and understood with a quiet finality that he would not see this place bloom again. Some things, once seen clearly, cannot be returned to their previous form. Inside, he made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and his laptop. The first call was to his attorney. Her name was Diane Keller, a woman known for her precision and her refusal to waste time on theatrics. Julian had met her years ago during a zoning dispute involving the nursery. She answered on the second ring. "This is Diane. It's Julian Mercer," he said. "I need to initiate a divorce. I have documentation. I want everything handled cleanly, quickly, and without room for interpretation." There was a brief pause on the line, not of surprise, but of assessment. "Do you have evidence of infidelity?" she asked. "Yes. Verifiable. Completely." Another pause, shorter this time. "Then we proceed strategically. I'll need copies of everything. We'll structure the filing to protect your assets and minimize exposure. Timing will matter. Julian looked out the window as the first pale light touched the tops of the trees. Timing is already decided, he said. She'll be back in 2 weeks. I want everything in place. Before she walks through that door, Diane's voice shifted, just slightly, into something that resembled approval. Understood. Send me the documents by noon. We'll start immediately. The call ended. Julian did not linger. The next call was to his financial advisor, then to the bank, then to the small network of professionals who had, over the years, helped him build a life that Serena had quietly come to rely on without ever fully understanding its structure. Each conversation was direct, efficient, stripped of unnecessary detail. He did not explain why. He did not justify. He simply acted. By mid-morning, the framework of Serena's world had begun to shift beneath her feet, though she would not feel it yet. The joint investment accounts were being restructured, funds withdrawn or reallocated according to legal guidance. Lines of credit tied to her professional ventures were being reviewed, their backing quietly removed. The apartment they owned, still under mortgage, still partially leveraged through Julian's income, was set in motion to be transferred entirely into her name, along with its remaining debt. It was not vindictive. It was precise. Julian was not interested in destroying Serena. He was interested in removing himself so completely that nothing she stood on would remain supported by him. In the afternoon, he drove to the nursery. The staff greeted him as they always did, with easy familiarity, unaware that they were standing at the edge of a closing chapter. Julian gathered them near the main greenhouse, his hands resting lightly on the edge of a work table. I'm transferring ownership, he said, his tone steady. Effective at the end of the month. There was a ripple of confusion, then concern. One of the longtime employees, a man named Carlos who had worked beside Julian for over a decade, stepped forward. You're selling? He asked. Julian shook his head. I've arranged for it to be acquired by a conservation trust. They'll keep operations intact. Everyone stays on. Benefits remain. Nothing changes for you. Carlos frowned, searching his face. But why? Julian allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Because it's time, he said. It was the only answer he offered. That evening, he returned home and began the physical process of leaving. It was quieter than one might expect. No dramatic packing, no frantic sorting. Just a series of deliberate movements through rooms that had once held shared meaning. He took only what belonged to him in the most essential sense. Personal documents, a few changes of clothes, tools he had used for years, a handful of books worn soft at the edges. The rest he left untouched. Serena's things remained exactly as they were, arranged in the careful order she preferred. It was not kindness. It was indifference shaped into form. By the third day, the house had begun to feel different. Not emptier, but altered. As if the center of gravity had shifted slightly off axis. Julian walked through each room once more, not to reminisce, but to confirm. The living room, with its neutral tones and curated art. The kitchen, still bearing faint traces of meals that no longer existed. The bedroom, where the bed now looked too large for a single narrative. He paused there the longest, his gaze resting on the space where Serena had slept. For a moment, a memory surfaced uninvited. Her laughter years ago, the way she used to reach for his hand without thinking, the quiet intimacy of a life that had once been mutual. He let the memory pass without resistance. It did not belong to the present. On the dining table, he arranged the final pieces. The divorce papers, neatly clipped and signed where necessary. The folder of evidence, organized with the same care he had given it from the beginning. Photographs, reports, timestamps. Not excessive, not cruel, just undeniable. Beside them, he placed a small envelope containing a single key, the new key to the house, after he had the locks changed that morning. It was a practical gesture. Serena would still have access to what was now legally hers. But it would not be the same access she had taken for granted before. Julian stood over the table for a moment, studying the arrangement. There was no note, no explanation. Words, he understood now, were unnecessary when the truth had already been documented with such clarity. Anything he wrote would only give Serena something to argue with, something to reinterpret. Silence, in this case, was the most complete form of closure. On the final evening, he sat once more in the backyard as the temperature dropped toward freezing. The garden was nearly bare now, the last leaves scattered across the stone paths. The air held that particular stillness that comes just before winter fully arrives, when everything seems to pause in anticipation of change. Julian breathed in slowly, the cold sharp in his lungs. For 20 years, this had been his ground, his work, his offering. He had shaped it with care, believing that what he built would be shared, that the roots he tended would anchor more than just plants. He had been wrong about that part, but not about the work itself. The work had been real. It always would be. He stood, brushing his hands together as if finishing a task. Inside, the house was quiet. The table was set. The evidence was waiting. Julian took one last look around, not searching for meaning, not asking for anything in return. Then he turned off the lights, walked to the door, and stepped out into the night. He did not lock it behind him. There was nothing left inside that required protection. Julian left just after midnight, the kind of hour when even familiar streets feel briefly unclaimed. The sky was clear, stretched wide and indifferent above the sleeping neighborhood, and the cold had settled in with quiet authority. His truck idled in the driveway, exhaust rising in pale ribbons that disappeared almost as soon as they formed. He stood for a moment beside it, keys in hand, not out of hesitation but acknowledgement. There is a difference. Hesitation asks for permission to stay. Acknowledgement simply recognizes what is ending. The house behind him was dark, its windows reflecting nothing back. Inside, the table remained as he had arranged it, documents aligned, evidence patient, the final structure of truth waiting for discovery. Julian did not look back again. He opened the truck door, climbed in, and pulled away from the curb with the steady, unhurried motion of a man who had already left long before his body followed. The city thinned quickly at that hour. Traffic lights cycled through empty intersections, red to green to red again, as if performing for no one. Julian drove through them with a quiet attentiveness, hands steady on the wheel, his mind not crowded with thoughts but focused on sequence. There were still things to do before he reached whatever came next. He merged onto the highway heading north, the road stretching out in long, dark ribbons under the glow of distant overhead lamps. The hum of the engine settled into a rhythm that matched his breathing. He had packed lightly, 2 duffel bags in the back seat, a small box of documents, a thermos of coffee. The rest of his life, the visible part of it, remained behind him. He drove for 3 hours before the first hint of dawn began to soften the horizon. The sky shifted from black to a deep, uncertain blue, and the landscape around him slowly revealed itself. Fields edged with frost, skeletal trees lining the road, the occasional farmhouse standing silent and self-contained. Julian did not turn on the radio. Silence suited him. It allowed him to remain inside the clarity he had built, uninterrupted by voices that had nothing to do with what he was doing. His first stop was in Michigan. Owen's campus rose out of the early morning like a small city unto itself. Brick buildings, quiet courtyards, lampposts still lit despite the growing daylight. Julian parked near the dormitory Owen had described over the phone months ago and sat for a moment, watching students move through the cold air with backpacks slung over their shoulders, their lives still open, still forming. When Owen answered the door, his expression shifted almost immediately from casual surprise to something more alert. "Dad," he said, "what are you doing here?" Julian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The room smelled faintly of coffee and textbooks, the air warm in contrast to the sharp cold outside. "I needed to see you," Julian said. Owen studied his face for a second longer, then nodded toward the chair by the desk. "Okay, you look serious." Julian set the folder on the small table between them. "I am," he said. There was no easy way to begin, so he did not attempt one. He opened the folder and slid a portion of the documents toward Owen. "I want you to see this before your mother has a chance to explain anything." Owen's brow furrowed as he looked down at the first page, then the second. The confusion in his expression sharpened quickly into disbelief, then something harder. He flipped through the photographs more quickly than Julian had expected, his movements abrupt, his breathing changing in small, controlled ways. "Is this real?" Owen asked, his voice low. "Yes." Owen sat back, one hand running through his hair as if trying to dislodge what he had just seen. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to be certain." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a group of students passed by laughing, their voices muffled through the glass. Owen looked at his father again, this time with a mixture of anger and something like respect. "And you're just leaving?" he asked. Julian met his gaze evenly. "I'm removing myself," he said. "There's a difference." Owen let out a short, humorless breath. "She's going to try to spin this. You know that. That's why you're seeing it now." Owen nodded slowly, the anger in him settling into a colder, more deliberate shape. "You don't want me to confront her yet." "No," Julian said. "I want you to understand the truth. What you choose to do with that is up to you. But I won't have you caught in a version of events that isn't real." Owen closed the folder, his jaw set. "You're not the one who should be leaving," he said. Julian considered that, then shook his head slightly. "Sometimes the cleanest outcome isn't the one that looks fair," he replied. Owen looked down at the folder again, then back up. "Where are you going?" "Somewhere quiet." It was enough. Owen stood, crossing the small room in 2 steps, and pulled his father into a brief, firm embrace. It was not sentimental. It was acknowledgement. "Call me when you get there," he said. Julian nodded. "I will." By mid-morning, Julian was back on the road, heading east toward Vermont. The miles passed in a steady blur of asphalt and sky, the landscape shifting gradually as he moved farther from the life he had known. He stopped only once for fuel and coffee, the routine actions grounding him in the present. There was no sense of urgency, only direction. Lily's campus was quieter when he arrived, the kind of place where buildings seemed to settle into the surrounding hills rather than dominate them. She met him outside the main entrance of her dorm, her expression bright at first, then quickly changing as she took in his face. "Dad? What's wrong?" she asked. Julian did not answer immediately. He handed her the folder instead. "Let's sit," he said. They found a bench overlooking a stretch of bare trees and distant mountains. The air was colder here, the wind carrying a sharper edge. Lily pulled her coat tighter around her as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the first page with casual curiosity that shifted, almost instantly, into shock. "No," she said softly, as if the word itself might undo what she was seeing. Julian remained silent, giving her the space to move through it in her own way. She turned another page, then another, her movements slower now, more deliberate. Her breathing grew uneven, and she pressed her lips together as if holding something back. How could she? The sentence trailed off, unfinished. Julian looked out at the horizon, where the mountains rose in quiet indifference. "People make choices," he said. "Not always good ones." Lily closed the folder abruptly, her hands trembling slightly. "Does Owen know?" "He does." She nodded, swallowing hard. "And you're leaving?" It wasn't a question. "Yes." Lily looked at him then, really looked, as if trying to understand the shape of what he had become in the span of a few weeks. "Are you okay?" she asked. Julian considered the question carefully. "I'm clear," he said. Lily let out a breath that seemed to carry both relief and grief. "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "But it's enough." She leaned against him then, her head resting briefly on his shoulder the way she had when she was younger. He placed a hand lightly on her back, feeling the familiar weight of his child, now grown but still connected in ways that did not require explanation. "She's going to try to explain it," Lily said quietly. "She always explains things." "I know." Lily pulled back, her expression firming. "I don't want to hear it," she said. "Not if this is what it is." Julian nodded. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said. "Just don't let anyone decide it for you." She held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small, resolute nod. "I won't." They sat there a while longer, not speaking, the silence between them steady and unforced. When Julian finally stood, Lily rose with him. "Wherever you go," she said, "I hope it's better." Julian allowed himself a faint smile. "It will be different," he said. "That's a start." She hugged him tightly this time, longer than Owen had, her grip carrying a quiet refusal to let him disappear completely. "Call me too," she said. "I will." Back on the road, the sky had shifted again, clouds gathering in slow-moving layers that hinted at snow somewhere ahead. Julian drove west now, the direction he had chosen not for symbolism but for its geography. The mountains waited there, distant but certain. As the miles passed, he felt the last threads of his previous life loosen and fall away. Not violently, not with regret, but with the same inevitability as leaves leaving a tree that can no longer sustain them. He had done what needed to be done. The truth was placed where it could not be rewritten. The connections that mattered had been secured with honesty rather than illusion. What remained was not loss, exactly. It was space. By the time the first snow began to fall, light and tentative against the windshield, Julian no longer felt like he was leaving something behind. He felt like he was moving towards something that had been waiting for him all along. Serena expected the house to greet her the way it always had, with quiet familiarity, with the subtle assurance that no matter how far she had moved in the world outside, there was still a place that held her shape. The flight back had been long but softened by the afterglow of what she told herself had been a necessary season, a strategic alignment of opportunity and timing. The campaign had surged in the final weeks, donors more engaged, messaging sharper, her own role more visible than ever. Victor had said as much more than once, his voice warm with approval, his attention focused in a way that made her feel chosen, elevated, seen. It had not felt like betrayal to her. Not in the way the word would later settle. It had felt like evolution, reinvention, a step into a version of herself that no longer waited in the margins of someone else's quiet life. The car from the airport dropped her at the curb just as the late afternoon light began to thin into evening. The neighborhood looked unchanged, almost stubbornly so. The same trees, now stripped bare. The same houses, their windows glowing softly against the early dusk. Serena stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement, her suitcase trailing behind her with a steady rhythm. She paused for a moment, adjusting her coat, breathing in the cold air. There was a flicker of anticipation in her chest. Not for Julian, not exactly, but for the return itself. For the re-entry into a space she still believed she controlled. She reached the front door and noticed, distantly, that the porch light was off. A small detail, easily overlooked. She inserted her key into the lock and turned it. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the house was dark, not dim in the comfortable way of evening, but fully unlit, as if no one had been there to mark the passage of time. Serena stepped in, her heels echoing slightly on the hardwood. "Julian," she called, her voice carrying farther than she expected. No answer. She frowned, setting her suitcase down near the entry. It was possible he had gone out. The thought came easily, almost automatically. But something about the silence felt different. Not temporary. Not waiting. She walked into the living room, reaching for the light switch. The lamp flickered on, casting a warm glow across furniture that looked exactly as she remembered it. And yet, somehow, not. The room felt staged, preserved, as if it had been arranged and then left untouched. "Julian," she called again, louder this time. Still nothing. A thin thread of unease began to wind its way through her composure. She moved toward the kitchen, her steps slower now, more deliberate. The air held no trace of recent activity, no lingering scent of coffee, no faint hum of conversation or television, just stillness. And then she saw the table. At first, it did not register as anything unusual, just papers, neatly arranged, placed with a kind of deliberate symmetry that suggested intention. Serena stepped closer, her pulse beginning to quicken in small, irregular beats. The top sheet bore her name. Not handwritten. Typed. Formal. She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the document before lifting it. The words resolved slowly, as if her mind needed time to accept their meaning. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Serena blinked, once, then again, as if the act might clear the page. It did not. Her eyes moved down the document, catching phrases, legal language, dates. Her name. Julian's name. The structure of an ending laid out in precise, unemotional terms. "No," she said quietly, the word slipping out before she could stop it. It wasn't denial yet. Not fully. Just resistance. Her gaze shifted to the folder beneath the papers. She opened it with hands that were no longer entirely steady. Photographs. Reports. Dates. Locations. Each piece arranged with the same meticulous care she had once admired in Julian's work. For a moment, she did not understand what she was looking at. Then recognition began to surface, slow and unavoidable. The hotel entrance. The restaurant. The angle of her own body leaning toward Victor. The space between them that was no longer ambiguous. Her breath caught, sharp and shallow. She flipped to another page, then another. The evidence did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply existed. And in its existence, It removed every version of the story she had been preparing to tell. Serena stepped back from the table as if the papers themselves had shifted the air around her. "No," she said again, louder now, but the word had already begun to fracture. This was not how it was supposed to happen. She had imagined the return differently. A conversation, perhaps. A careful framing. An explanation built on the language of growth, of distance, of unmet needs. She had rehearsed it in quiet moments. How she would position herself not as a betrayer, but as someone who had simply moved beyond the confines of a life that no longer fit. But this left no room for narrative. Only fact. Her phone buzzed in her hand, the sudden vibration startling in the silence. She looked down. A message from Owen. Then another from Lily. She opened Owen's first. "We saw everything. Don't call me until you're ready to tell the truth. No spin. No excuses." Her stomach dropped, a cold, hollow sensation that spread quickly through her chest. She opened Lily's message next. "I don't recognize you right now. I need space. Please don't try to explain this away." Serena lowered the phone slowly, her fingers tightening around it, as if it might anchor her to something stable. The room seemed to tilt, not physically, but perceptually, as if the axis of her life had shifted without warning. They knew. Of course they knew. Julian had made sure of that. The realization settled with a weight that was both crushing and precise. This wasn't chaos. It was design. Her gaze returned to the table, to the documents, to the quiet, undeniable order of it all. Julian hadn't confronted her. He hadn't argued. He hadn't given her the opportunity to shape the story. He had simply removed himself and left the truth behind like a structure she could not dismantle. "Julian," she said, reaching for her phone again. Her hands moved quickly. Now, urgency replacing shock. She dialed his number. The line rang once, then cut to a recorded message. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Serena stared at the screen, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. "No," she whispered, dialing again. The same message. "No longer in service." She tried another number, his work line. Disconnected. The office. A generic voicemail stating that ownership had changed and operations would continue under new management. Each attempt closed another door. Each tone a quiet confirmation that the man she had spent 20 years with had not just left, he had erased his path behind him. Serena lowered the phone slowly, the silence of the house pressing in from all sides. For the first time since stepping inside, she truly felt alone. Not temporarily, not circumstantially, completely. She moved through the house then, almost instinctively, opening doors, checking rooms as if he might still be there somewhere, as if this might still be reversible. The bedroom, empty. The closet, his side cleared of anything personal. The bathroom, no trace of his presence beyond what the space itself remembered. Each room offered the same answer. Absence, deliberate and complete. When she returned to the kitchen, the table remained unchanged, the documents exactly where he had left them. Serena sank into one of the chairs, the weight of everything settling into her body in a way that made it difficult to breathe evenly. This was not a confrontation she could win. There was no audience to persuade, no argument to construct, no version of events that could overwrite what had already been seen, documented, and shared. Julian had not fought her. He had simply stepped out of reach. And in doing so, he had taken with him the one thing she had not realized she depended on. The quiet stability that had allowed her to believe she could risk everything without consequence. Outside, the light faded completely, leaving the house suspended in the soft glow of its interior lamps. Serena sat there, surrounded by the remnants of a life she no longer recognized, and understood, with a clarity that came too late, that some endings are not loud. They do not arrive with raised voices or broken objects. They arrive in silence, in order, in the careful arrangement of truth that leaves no space for denial. And in that silence, the reality of what she had lost began, slowly and inexorably, to take shape. The collapse did not happen all at once. It never does. For Serena, it began with distance, subtle at first, almost polite. Victor's messages, once immediate and attentive, became delayed, then abbreviated, then carefully neutral. The tone shifted before the content did, a cooling she tried to ignore by telling herself he was simply overwhelmed with the final stretch of the campaign. She left him a voicemail the night after she returned home, her voice controlled, measured, as if nothing had changed. Call me when you can. We need to talk. He did not call that night, nor the next morning. When he finally responded, it was not with a call, but with a message. Things are complicated right now. We need to be careful. Serena read the words twice, then a third time, searching for the man she thought she knew between the lines. There was no warmth in them, no urgency, only distance disguised as caution. She called him anyway. This time he answered. Serena, he said, his voice lower than usual, stripped of its usual polish. I was going to reach out. You were, she replied, her tone tight despite her effort to keep it even. Because it doesn't feel that way. There was a pause on the line, the kind that signals calculation rather than hesitation. Listen, Victor said, the situation has changed. The campaign is under scrutiny. There are questions about internal conduct. Optics matter right now more than anything. Serena felt a flicker of irritation. What does that have to do with us? Another pause. Longer this time. It has everything to do with us, he said finally. We can't be associated. Not like this. The words landed with a dull, heavy finality. Serena's grip on the phone tightened. So that's it, she asked. After everything? Victor exhaled slowly, as if preparing to deliver a line he had rehearsed. It was a situation, he said. A moment. We both knew what it was. Serena closed her eyes, the room around her fading into a blur of muted shapes. No, she said quietly. That's not what you said. Serena, he replied, his voice sharpening slightly. You're a smart woman. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The call ended shortly after. Not with resolution, not with apology, but with a clean, efficient severing that mirrored the one Julian had executed. Only this one lacked dignity. Within days, the consequences began to surface publicly. The campaign, already fragile beneath the weight of competing interests, found itself entangled in a quiet scandal. Nothing explosive, nothing headline-grabbing, but enough. Questions about internal relationships. Concerns about professionalism. A narrative that suggested distraction, misalignment, poor judgment. Victor was removed from his position with a statement that emphasized the need for renewed focus and integrity. Serena's name was not mentioned directly, but it did not need to be. In the world she had so eagerly entered, implication traveled faster than fact. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. The same rooms that had once opened to her with easy warmth now seemed to close just before she arrived. Her role in the firm, once expanding, began to contract. Meetings she would have led were reassigned. Projects were redistributed. The language used around her shifted, still polite, still professional, but edged with something unmistakable. Caution, distance, reputation, she discovered, was not a structure you could rebuild quickly once it had been quietly undermined. At home, the silence remained. Not the composed silence Julian had left behind, but a heavier version, one that pressed against the walls and filled the spaces between objects. Serena moved through the house with a growing awareness of how much of her life had been supported by something she had never fully acknowledged. The mortgage notices arrived with new clarity. The accounts she had assumed were stable revealed their dependencies. The subtle network of security Julian had maintained, financial, structural, emotional, was gone, and in its absence, everything felt more precarious. She tried, at first, to reconstruct a sense of control. She reorganized her schedule, reached out to contacts, attempted to reframe the narrative in conversations that never quite gained traction. But each effort felt thinner than the last, as if she were building on ground that no longer held. At night, she sat at the dining table where Julian had left the documents, though she had long since moved them into a drawer. The table itself had become a kind of anchor point, a place where the reality of what had happened remained impossible to ignore. She replayed moments in her mind, not the affair itself, but the choices that had led to it. The small dismissals, the quiet justifications, the assumption that she could step outside the boundaries of her life without those boundaries shifting in response. It was not regret in the dramatic sense. Not yet. It was something quieter, a recognition of miscalculation, of cause and effect unfolding with a precision she had not anticipated. Weeks passed. The campaign concluded without her. The firm adjusted around her. Victor disappeared into another opportunity somewhere beyond her reach, his name resurfacing occasionally in industry updates that carried no trace of what had happened between them. Serena remained, but in a diminished capacity, her presence no longer central, no longer essential. And in the quiet spaces of that diminished life, the absence of Julian became more defined. Not as a person she missed in the traditional sense, but as a force she had underestimated. The stability he had provided had been so constant, so unobtrusive, that she had mistaken it for permanence rather than choice. Now, in its absence, she began to understand its value, not emotionally, but structurally. It had been the foundation on which everything else had rested. Without it, the architecture of her life felt incomplete. Far away, in a place where the air carried a different kind of silence, Julian stood at the edge of a small wooden deck, watching the first true snowfall of the season settle over the town below. The mountains rose in layered shadows beyond the valley, their peaks softened by cloud and distance. The town itself was modest, just a handful of streets, a scattering of buildings, the kind of place that existed outside the urgency of larger worlds. His cafe sat behind him, its windows glowing warmly against the cold, the scent of fresh coffee and pine drifting faintly through the open door. It was not grand. It was not ambitious. But it was his. Julian breathed in deeply, the cold air sharp and clean in his lungs. Snow fell in steady, deliberate flakes, each one distinct for a moment before joining the quiet accumulation on the ground. There was a rhythm to it, a patience that felt familiar. Inside, a small group of early customers spoke in low voices, their conversations blending into a gentle hum. Someone laughed softly. A cup was set down on a wooden table. Ordinary sounds. Grounding sounds. Julian stepped back inside, closing the door behind him. The warmth wrapped around him immediately, a contrast that felt earned rather than given. He moved behind the counter, adjusting a kettle, checking the grind of the coffee, small tasks that required attention but not urgency. A woman at one of the tables looked up and smiled in quiet acknowledgement. He returned the gesture, not out of obligation, but because it felt natural. There was no performance here. No need to be anything other than present. Later, when the morning rush had passed and the town settled into its slower rhythm, Julian stepped outside again. The snowfall had deepened, covering the ground in a smooth, unbroken layer of white. The world looked simpler under it. Cleaner. Not because it had erased what came before, but because it had allowed everything to rest. He stood there for a long moment, hands in his coat pockets, watching his breath form and disappear in the cold air. There was no triumph in him, no sense of victory, only a quiet, steady understanding that he had chosen a path and followed it to its conclusion. The pain that had once defined his days had not vanished entirely, but it had changed. It no longer demanded attention. It existed as part of a larger landscape, one that included peace, clarity, and something that felt, unmistakably, like freedom. Julian looked out over the snow-covered town, the mountains beyond, and allowed himself a small, unguarded breath. For the first time in a long while, there was nothing behind him pulling him backward. No unfinished conversations. No unresolved truths. Only the present moment, clear and unencumbered. And in that moment, standing beneath a sky that stretched wide and indifferent above him, Julian Mercer understood that healing was not an event. It was a process. Quiet. Patient. Much like the growth he had spent his life tending. The difference now was that the ground beneath him was entirely his own.